and welcome to the Life of a Crafty Textile Lady channel. I'm Hillary, and thank you for joining me today on another part of my adventure in building a vintage-inspired wardrobe. Today's video is a little bit of a trip down a research rabbit hole reviewing 4 editions of Knit and Sew magazine from 1960. That's Heaven the Quaker Parrot. You'll meet her later. So Heaven's decided to join us today. This should make editing extra interesting. We'll see how this goes. Or maybe any of this footage with her on my shoulder will never see the light of day. I don't know. Bye. Okay. Is Mama boring? Okay. You go back to your nubs. Okay. When conducting academic research for higher education or period-accurate reproductions, primary resources like women's journals are often considered the best source of information because what you're accessing is raw data that hasn't been filtered by anyone else's perspectives. So makers and collectors of vintage clothing often seek out periodicals from the era that they're trying to emulate in their wardrobe. So in this first video, I am looking at 4 editions of Knit and Sew magazine that were published in the first half of 1960. Knit and Sew was put out by Fleetway Publishers in London, UK. And at this point of the video, I would love to tell you something about the history of the magazine, how popular it was, maybe something about the staff who work there. But it turns out that that would basically impossible without me writing a master's thesis on women's journals at the time because there is so little information out there. So what I can tell you is that magazines were published under the Fleetway banner from 1959 through 1968. But that's really about it that I could find about them. In one of the issues I have, there is a reference to a reader who has written in a lot in the letters to the editor section. So that leads me to believe that the magazine was published earlier than 1959. But that's really all I know. This era of magazine publishing had a lot of turnover in terms of the owners. And I have a feeling, given that publications kept changing hands a lot, literally the paper trail on their history was lost in the process. Also, while I try to keep things light around here, I would be a terrible feminist if I didn't point out that craft magazines and ladies' journals are historically considered not serious topics. So the chances of their history being saved versus a more esteemed publication, not nearly as likely. So for lots of different reasons, the background about this magazine that I can provide you is quite light. But trust me, I tried. I tried everything I could think of, including looking for an obituary for Eileen Maxwell, who is the only human that's listed throughout this entire periodical, but that was a dead end too. So I don't know, maybe she was a pen name, maybe she's not real, I don't know. But let's move on to a section where I can actually tell you some things. And maybe I can get through it without too many Parrot interruptions. Maybe.
Let's start with the covers, as they alone can provide you with quite a bit of information if you're looking at an old magazine that you're potentially going to purchase. Sometimes they have a date on them, and this one includes the year, which is great. So immediately, we know what era of fashions are going to be found inside and the type of seasonal clothing you might find. Heavier weight sweaters in the February issue, and something more lightweight from this issue in June. The price is also important to note to get a sense of the quality of information that you're going to find inside. Many craft magazines of that era were published by a company making craft supplies or funded by advertisers. If you're looking for really detailed articles, you're more likely to find those in more expensive magazines as they had to pay a writer to do that work. This magazine cost 1 shilling and 6 pence, which in my research I found was an average price to pay for a periodical like this. Compare that to a Women's Weekly, which was put out by the same publisher, but contained a lot more information, so it cost over 3 times that amount. The cover also gives you information about what you might expect to find inside. This February issue isn't very helpful in this instance because of this really bizarre graphic design choice to hide sweaters behind a blown-up image of a doll. It's weird, but the other covers do a good job of highlighting some of the projects inside. You can use my hand for scale to see that Knit and Sew is a fairly narrow periodical in terms of size, so I think the graphic designers who made this magazine did a pretty good job with what limited space they had to work with. Let's have a look at the June issue to get a sense of what's inside. In the front there are some ads, a word from Eileen Maxwell, who has no title, which is why I'm wondering if she's a pen name, and letters from readers. And on the next page, you're launched straight into knitting patterns. There is no index or table of contents anywhere in this periodical, which, from my initial research, appears to be pretty common for the time period. Both of these patterns also finish on different pages. One of them 2 pages over on page 6, and the other on page 14. This is also common because space is at a premium, so if you're interested in a specific pattern in a magazine you found, make sure all the pages are there before falling in love with it. Each issue that I have includes some sort of iron-on transfer which you can use for anything your heart desires, not just the door plates that the magazine shows. A lot of these stitching charts, as well as sewing patterns, were things to be ordered from this magazine, so in some sense this periodical is also a catalog. So that's not a lot of use if you're looking for vintage sewing patterns, but it does provide a lot of visual information if you're altering more modern patterns to look vintage. For example, the placement of broderie anglais in this illustration is quite helpful to get details like this correct for your own makes. In 1960 at least, they featured these bonus books on a specific theme which is highlighted on the cover. So that's another thing to check for to see that it hasn't been removed. And like the embroidery transfers, some of the other home deck projects can also be inspiration for apparel. I would love to make these fluttering butterflies and put them on a skirt. And there's also stuff that's just delightfully weird, such as this bathroom set consisting of a frilly toilet seat cover and toiletries container. Just marvel in that for a minute. At first I thought the container was a toilet roll cozy, which really would have put it on another level of kitsch fabulousness. I'm pretty sure my parrot would chew and attack these with great enthusiasm if I installed them in our bathroom. Let's just say that this particular set doesn't really match my lifestyle. Hey look, a parrot! And that's it for our look at the issue from June. There's a few things I want to highlight in specific issues of Knit and Sew. One of the challenges that knitters face while working with vintage patterns is finding larger sizes. The issue from February actually has a knitting pattern designed for a fuller figure, with a bust size range of 40 to 48 inches. While that's hardly inclusive, it's much better than the something like 32 to 34 inch range that are typically found in vintage knitting patterns. So if you need something a bit bigger and don't want to do the math to grade it up to your size, digging in magazines like this might be worth your while. A fun PSA that no one should ever put a cat embroidery patch on the back of a child's pants. Don't do it. Just don't do it. I love some really out there things, but this would not only be really uncomfortable, but also wildly impractical when the embroidery would absolutely get stuck on anything and everything that a child sits on. In the March issue, I thought it was interesting that these sewing trims were replicated to actual size, which makes it easier to see what sizes of trim were available in the era. Understandably, one page from a magazine shouldn't be considered the absolute authority on all of the trims of this kind, but it does allow you to know the scale of trims in photographs compared to their actual size. On the preceding page is a simple sewing pattern that the reader could replicate at home. So while most of the sewing patterns highlighted in Knit and Sew had to be ordered through the mail, there were a few like this. They were simple in silhouette, so fairly easy for a home sewer to scale up on their own, but from what I could find in my 4 issues is that they were only shown in a single size.
And finally, a gem that I found from the May 1960 issue. This is for all the knitters out there who have looked at vintage patterns and bemoaned the lack of information about the yarn that you're supposed to use in said patterns that are recommended. Common lore from what I've been told is the reason for that is there was just way less yarn out on the market, so ye average knitter knew all of the yarn that was available to them. But it turns out there's another reason. J.A. writes, I sometimes have difficulty in obtaining the wools you recommend for your knitting designs as I live a long way from any large shops. Many magazines stress the importance of using the wool recommended. Is this really necessary? Answer: yes. Whenever possible, you should use the wool we suggest because our garments are check knitted in that particular wool, and tensions vary so much between different makes, even of the same ply, you might find that your tension is incorrect, resulting in a larger or smaller garment. If you do have difficulty in obtaining the correct wool, write to the spinners, whose address you will very often find an advertisement in the magazine. They will be pleased to supply you with the name and address of your nearest stockist. Really? You should never, ever substitute yarn in a pattern? Really? So we live in an era where knitting patterns are written by both designers hired by a yarn company to help promote use of their products and independent designers who make patterns for the purpose of making money off of selling those patterns. In 1960, the knitting patterns found in periodicals like this were pretty much monopolized by the yarn companies. So of course they don't want you to use anything but their product. That's garbage. You are the boss of your own knitting, or any other makes for that matter, and you should do whatever you want, whatever's available to you, and figure out how to make it work.
Having a quick flip in the remainder of the May issue yields some incredibly stinking cute boleros to knit. It also shows just how much advertising can be found throughout this magazine.
So, thank you for joining us today on this review of 4 issues of Knit and Sew magazine from 1960. Apparently she doesn't want to stay. Anyway, so the magazines are a great resource for vintage knitting patterns, home decor, and they're good to learn a little bit about vintage sewing details of garments from the era. I hope you've learned something and are maybe interested in picking up a vintage publication of your own. As I said at the top, this will be a video series, so if you're interested in seeing more, maybe hit the subscribe button. If you've enjoyed the video, hit that like button below. And if you want, in the comments, let me know the best or maybe the weirdest thing you've ever found in a vintage magazine. Until next time, bye!
And for those of you wondering what it's like trying to film a video with a parrot, here's an outtake for you. However, just a fair warning that Heaven is a Quaker parrot, which is the loudest of the small parrot species. So if you're listening with headphones, you should probably turn the volume down right now. Okay.
When conducting academic research Hi, what's up? Yeah? I thought I was boring. No, I'm not boring? Okay. So can I talk to the people? Is that allowed? Maybe? Maybe? Seriously? Filming in the time of plague is really, really hard. You can't go anywhere. I live in a 1-bedroom condo. I have a parrot. Yeah? Can Mama film? Yeah, could Mama film? Maybe? Maybe? But you thought this was boring. Yeah, you thought this was boring. Little inside baseball moment for you here. My next door neighbor is getting something done, so there's people in the hallway. She likes yelling at people in the hallway. I have not taught her to do this. I do not encourage her to do this. She weighs slightly more than a chocolate croissant. I don't know what she thinks she's gonna do with the humans in the hallway. She doesn't even like large groups of people that much. Yeah. Can I go back to filming now? Evidently not. We're taking a break.